Three Righteous Mamas is a podcast from The Signal that is on a mission to transform our country. We tell the stories that matter, celebrate the power and hope of pissed off mamas who are building a better future for all of our children. Hi, I'm Martha Pinkoffs.
And I'm Cristina Sansun Ramirez.
And I'm Muna Husseini.
We love being in conversation with y'all. Please subscribe, leave us a review, share our podcast with your friends in all of the social ways. Hashtag Three Righteous Mamas, hashtag the world for our kids. Today, we will be chatting with Alicia Garza about how we achieve racial justice, and it requires Black communities having transformational power to be lifted, but also be leading the way for all of us. Y'all, this morning, I got my paper. I started reading it. It's one of my favorite things. And there's an entire section devoted to America's mothers are in crisis. Is anyone listening to them? I mean, it's a whole special section, and there are a lot of really powerful parts to it. But in one of the articles in it, they explore what it's been like for three different moms as they have navigated the pandemic and motherhood and work and childcare and feeding and laundry and all of the things that we have been doing for a year. And I felt this like actual release when I read it, because I think it felt like a relief to me to see other people validating how hard this is.
Yeah.
Which seems crazy. Like I should be able to carry that on my own, but what these women go through is incredibly hard. And I was just thinking about, how we've managed in my house all of these endless days of being here for almost a year. Thank God my kids are able to attend school in person since for a few months, but it's really an unbelievable experience to pull back from and look at.
Yeah, it's intense, right? I mean, it's I was just thinking about it because we're coming up on in a few weeks a full year of lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel super fortunate that I think about some of the folks I know that have lost jobs, people that have gotten sick. And then if you're okay, you don't want to say anything, right? But you're
right.
Like Santi essentially for months just watched a lot of cartoons because I was working in another room, and I was like this lose guilt situation, right? Didn't feel safe sending him to school. At home, I felt like I couldn't fully be there for him. He's way too little for Zoom extravaganza, which also I question its, marathon days for kids going to Zoom classes also sounds pretty tough. I have trouble sitting through Zoom all day. I can't imagine for my guy's little spirit that he could handle it. But yeah, it's a lot, I think actually who put it best. And I laughed when she said it was Muna, when she said, I'm, not working from home, but living at work. And I was like, I laughed. And then I was like, oh, that's so sad.
Oh, it's sad.
It's sad. So, for you, Muna, I feel actually like out of all of us, you got the oldest kiddo. And just, I wonder, Santi's not depressed or sad. He's like, for him, it's kind of awesome. He saw some pictures today of me at work on a video, and he goes, please, mommy, don't go back to work ever. So he thinks it's fine, but I'm wondering for, your kids, Misha, especially your 13-year-old little girl, how this is all shaping up.
I will start by saying when anyone asks me how things are going, I always try to focus on what I have to be grateful for, because we are not struggling with a lot of things, right? Like we're both employed, and our families and friends are for the most part healthy. And so I always try to remind myself, hashtag we're dealing with first world problems. Mm-hmm. With that said, I believe all of us are still sustaining losses. When I think about my 12-year-old, she's literally been stuck in her room for the last year. She has not made friends. She has not had the normal awkward social interactions that are rites of passage in middle school. Like there is a lot of loss involved, and it breaks my heart. Now, I did read in another article, like I don't know if it's some post that's going around. I don't even know if it's real, but there was like a woman who said, I was a Bosnian refugee and I was out of school for 4 years and I survived. Like your kids are going to be fine. Like they need to know they're loved and they need to know, like all those things. And so I always try to have perspective, but there is a lot of loss involved. There's a lot of, just the regular everyday, like we gave away our life in the last year, especially because we've chosen to social distance. And I think there's a lot in that. I think I also get on behalf of my kids, but like my kids struggle and like we try to be positive, but we're not going to be like toxic positive and just act like everything's okay all the time. Like it's so hard to navigate all this. And I know for myself, I don't know if y'all saw like a Facebook post I made a while back, but I think it was home one evening. And okay, so I'm Muslim. I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't do any of like the fun stuff that maybe other people do. And my thing is eating. I love to eat. It is my vice. And I didn't even want to like, it wasn't even like the ordering was hard. It wasn't the dishes. I just was like, I don't even want to chew. Like that was too much. And I was sitting there and I was thinking about it. And I thought, why is chewing so hard right now? I didn't even want to do like a basic thing to like be a human. And I felt like it was a casualty of COVID. And then I was just so angry that like the one thing that like unequivocally has brought me joy for like my whole life, I no longer care for. And that felt like a huge loss for me because I was like, if I don't have food, what do I have? Like, I don't know if and it was crazy like how many people responded and were like, same, I feel the same. And I've hit this weird wall where I don't even want to like, and I'm an extrovert and I'm like, I don't even like people anymore. And I was like, not y'all, but it's just like, I don't even want to talk to people anymore. I'm just angry.
Well, but I bet you also want to talk to people like in a real way. There's something about this being over Zoom, like as a species, we are social creatures, right? There's something about the transfer of energy of being able to move around freely and see other people and speak to people. And it's going to be a strange year. And yes, all three of us on this call will greatly be okay. But it's okay to acknowledge that it's really hard and that, especially for a lot of moms that are working, have their kids there. And if they're may not have help from a partner really like that's fully in it with them, or maybe even if they do and it's just still too much, like it's a lot. We talked about one thing where we talked about our moms, that all three of our moms were actually stay at home, like working moms, working, taking care of us. And we were all like, that was really hard. I can't imagine doing that. But we're actually all doing it now.
It's true.
And doing our jobs on the side. So yeah, it's rough. I'm really glad I have this support system with y'all though, because I feel like it's good to chat with other folks. Yeah. And know you're not crazy. Be able to say out loud, yes, I have all of these things. And I'm so grateful for my health, for my financial stability. I cannot imagine for the people that are doing this under the pressure and duress of financial instability right now is just too much. Like today I was visiting a friend who lost his home, him and his partner and their kids, and they had to leave Austin and now they live, 45 minutes away, because they lost their home when they lost their work. And so it's just really that all of those pressures, so many people. But I feel really grateful that I have y'all, and I hope other moms also like build a network and that story lifts up people and know you're not alone, because there's just something powerful about knowing you're not alone.
Yeah.
This is definitely a highlight for me every week to be able to be in conversation with y'all and to talk about real people who are doing the work, and it gives me such hope, which is why it's so exciting to be talking to Alicia Garza today. And her book specifically is so on point, The Purpose of Power, How We Come Together When We Fall Apart. Because I think all of us are starting to fall apart a little bit, hit that wall, whatever it is you're struggling through. And so let's get to chatting with her. Today, we have Alicia Garza, co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, head B in charge of Black Futures Lab, host of Lady Don't Take No podcast. You can follow Alicia online via Twitter at Alicia Garza and on Instagram at Chasing Garza. Alicia is the author of The Purpose of Power, How We Come Together When We Fall Apart. It's described as an essential guide. The book tells Garza's story as an activist and shares lessons for future activists. So all of our audience members, pay attention. Being that we're the three righteous mamas, Alicia, we always start by asking our guests about their mama or any other strong maternal figure that helped shape the way you engage with the world. We know your book is dedicated to your mama who passed away recently. As you were writing the book, you say that she trained your eyes to see the world. Could you tell us more about this strength and this well that you pull from?
Absolutely. Well, it's so good to be here with y'all today, and thank you for having me. And I love that we're starting off talking about mamas who I think deserve all the reverence in the world, not just for holding together like everything, right? But it's something special to be able to grow a human. So shout out to you. And I hope to be following in your footsteps sometime soon. So, there's so much I can say about my mom, and it's been almost 3 years in a couple of months, and she really did train my eyes to see the world. And I think that is something that we all can kind of relate to, right? There's somebody in our lives who has taught us how to survive, taught us how to thrive, taught us how to navigate tricky situations, introduced us, right, to how to interpret what was happening around us. And then, of course, as we get older, right, we develop our own interpretations and we add our own lens to it based on kind of how we be in the world. But I think that I wanted to put my mom in this book so much because, when I think about politics, and I've been engaged in some form of political activity since I was 12. And when I think about politics, I often think that we don't do enough to reach all of the people who are looking for us. And that's a huge problem. And some of that problem comes from this way in which those of us who see the world differently because of the way we experience it, because of the way that we've been shaped within it, we find comfort and solace in each other. And what is challenging about that for the project of social change is that we need a bigger range in which to find solace, right? It can't just be the people who have had exactly the same experiences as us, think exactly the same ways that we do. And whenever I think about how I cherish being engaged in political activity, I think about my mom. And I think about her because my mom was not inherently political. She didn't see herself as political. I grew up hearing very contradictory stories about social change and activism and activists and social movements. And, with that, though, what I know is that my mom was decidedly feminist. She really believed not only the basic notion that women are people, right?
Radical.
But she also really believed that we belong to each other. She believed very deeply that women could do anything that men could do, that there should be no distinction there. And she lived her life in that way. And she trained my eyes to see the world in that way. And growing up, I always thought my mom was a superhero because she could literally do anything. And I remember even the day I got married, at that time I was I don't know, 28 or something like that. And she'd been bothering me for weeks about what was I going to do with my hair? What was I going to do with my makeup? And I was like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't care about these things. Right. And then, of course, the morning of, I like pull out this picture from a magazine with some intricate hairstyle. And my mom was like, and then did it, just like did it, right? Like that is the characteristic of a mama, right? Like we make all the things happen. And I think for me, when I think about social change, every time I'm engaged in this work, I think about my mom, and I think about breaking down what it is that we're up to and why in those very basic ways, not in the language that we use, but in the way that we be in the world. Belonging to each other means that we take care of each other, that we believe deeply that everybody deserves dignity. It means that we work hard to make sure that anybody who doesn't have what they need to live well can get it, and that they can depend on us, right? Because that's how we live in the world. We depend on each other to survive. And that dependence can be parasitic, or it can be cooperative, and it can be a way that helps to further nurture the connections between us. So all of that long story to say, I cherish my mom so much because she reminds me of what's important in this work. She reminds me of what's important in this world, and she makes me want to be a better human being every single day.
Please tell us your mama's name.
Oh, Lynette. Miss Lynette is what she would want to be called. But I called her Mumsy. That was my little nickname for her.
Well, if it's all right, prayers to Mumsy and Miss Lynette, and we have so much gratitude for her to bring you into this world, and that we get to highlight the great work that you are doing. And it's because of our mamas we're here, but we love talking to people that are putting the light into the world that we want to see, because that's hope, and that's the best gift we can give each other. And so with that said, I'll turn it over to Martha, who wants to chat a little bit about your book.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Well, yeah.
So part of the intention of this podcast is to imagine the world that we want to build for all of our children. And when I was reading your book, I just was underlining and underlining and underlining and thinking this, like, it's at the same time, it's about expansion of power from the few who hold it now to the many that deserve it and will hold it responsibly. And so it's about this huge thing, but it's your story through it is so intimate in the neighborhoods that you worked in and the relationships that you made, that I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that bridge between the intense intimacy and how we can use that to expand into power, because I just think it's such a beautiful thing.
Well, I believe that all organizing, all social change efforts that are successful are fundamentally about relationships. It is, I think, the difference in a lot of ways between organizing, right, and what most people understand as social change work, which is charity, right? Charity is more of a transactional engagement, and it doesn't actually foster ongoing and deep relationships. On the one side of it, right, people might engage in charity because they are wanting to give back to somebody who is in need or has less than they do, right? But that often is not an ongoing relationship. And frankly, so many people engage in that kind of transaction really distanced from the person that they're trying to touch. In contrast, I think organizing is really different. I mean, to get people to take risks, to do things that they may not have ever done before, to challenge power where it operates, you have to build trust. You have to build trust. It's the number one thing. And you know as well as I do, if somebody just walked up to you on the street, right, and said, I actually really believe you can leap over that car. Just leap. And you have no idea who they are. You're going to be like, first of all, why are you talking to me? Second of all, why would I do that? Right? Like,
why do you want me to hurt myself?
Yeah, I'm going about my day. Like, why are you in my business?
Yeah.
But somebody who you're building a relationship with, you might consider that request differently, because you've built a basis of trust. And, for me, movements we talk about in really interesting ways. We talk about movements in these ways that imply scale, right? Many, 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 many people. And it's sometimes hard for us to imagine, well, if we're touching so many people, how are we able to build that kind of intimate relationship? And I think that it's fundamentally one of the biggest challenges facing organizers. How do we reach as many people who are looking for us, right, as possible? But how do we also nurture the kinds of relationships that not only keep people in the fight for a long time, but encourage people to be able to see their own power and to start to exercise it? And I feel like part of what I was trying to do in the book was give some examples, like go behind the curtain and talk about what it means to build those deep relationships, to sit at kitchen tables, to sit on porches until dark and talk with people, not just about the campaign you're running, not just about all the things happening in the world, but you're talking with them about their everyday lives and you're sharing with them too. They're getting to know you and you're getting to know them. You're getting to know what they care about. You're getting to know what the names of their grandkids are and what their favorite colors are. You're getting to know how long they've lived in that house. You're also getting to know the risks that they've taken in the past and what happened. Sometimes people step out on a limb and it goes really badly. And that's why they don't want to get involved in organizing, right? Or in campaigns, because they took a risk and they failed. And so part of what happens in relationship also, I think, is that we're able to make sense of that which doesn't make sense. This arrangement that we have right now where literally it's everybody for themselves, right? That doesn't actually make sense. And it's not compatible with how we be in the world. And yet every single day people are absorbing that, right? They're absorbing that in the relationships that they have, the relationships they have with their employers, the relationships they have with their, well, not really with houses of worship. That's a little bit different, but the relationships they have in their family, right? All day long, you're getting these messages that are about being further alienated from yourself, from what you love, from what you believe, from what you dream of, for what you long for. But through the process of organizing, I think power gets built by building the kinds of relationships of trust that encourage people to take collective action, that encourage people to act in solidarity and in community with one another, and to stay in community when things get hard.
Yes.
It is so easy to put a Black Lives Matter sign up in your window, right? It's the easiest thing in the world. Right. But where the rubber hits the road is when your neighbor confronts you about being a reverse racist. Are you going to take it down or are you going to keep going? Where the rubber hits the road, right, is when, your uncle is watching Fox News and is asking you, why Black Lives Matter is rioting in cities across the nation. That's when the rubber hits the road. And it's really the relationships that keep us intact and that help us foment and dig into the vision of the world that we're trying to build together against all odds. So that's how I see that relationship of intimate relationships and power. And then movements are really the aggregate of all those relationships, right? And movements fundamentally are about moving more power into the hands of more people. But the smallest piece of that is getting people as individuals to see their own power and then aggregating that across relationships of trust. That is the secret of building movements.
The secret that we're trying to unlock, right? And I think that over the last 4 years, there's been such a focus on political power. Mm-hmm. And what I love about your work too is that you don't just talk about political power, because I think in this country we can get stuck on that, but you also talk about economic power. And so much of the present wealth disparity between Black and white communities comes from historical harm in this country, from redlining, slavery, to the failed promises of Reconstruction. And, when we think about getting to a place where we actually work towards a country where economic power is more equally or equitably distributed, that requires reparations. And that's a hard conversation in our country right now. But you believe deeply in reparations, and, explain that to folks about why it's so critical for our country to be able to look at the past to address the present pain.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, this is such a good question. I've been waiting for this. Thank you for asking it. So first and foremost, reparations is a big fancy word for repairing harm that has been done. And we've actually done reparations in a lot of different cases, right? We've seen it not only globally, but we've also seen it here in this country. In the state that I live in, California, we have paid reparations to survivors of Japanese internment. Okay. Here in this country, right, or actually, sorry, globally, right, when we look at the locations of the Holocaust, right, there is a repair that is happening, an effort at repair, right, which in some cases looked like money, but in a lot of cases, it also looked like interrupting the amnesia that surrounds the kind of devastation and oppression and slaughter that has been engaged in by governments around this world for the purposes, right, of solidifying social relationships that were unequal and solidifying economic relationships that were unequal because they benefited someone, right? As much as they hurt a group of people, it also benefited a group of people, which is why it's so hard in this country to unlock this question of reparations, because fundamentally, the United States, I think, is the engine of the United States is amnesia. It depends on forgetting the atrocities that it has committed, right, in the name of progress and in the name of being the United States of America. And so in that way, there is repair that needs to happen with Black communities. There's so many communities that also deserve repair. And I think the big question when we're trying to understand reparations is, what does repair look like? And how do you keep from reopening those wounds over and over again? Too many people in this country think that the way you repair the wound is just by not talking about it. But not talking about it means that it goes out of our consciousness and we're doomed to repeat it over and over again. Look at what happened at the US Capitol on January 6th, right? That was a replaying of moments that we have seen before in this country, not just in the last 4 years with Charlottesville or, any of those kinds of incidents, but also we saw this shit in the Civil War, right? This was like literally, right? The camp that was like, we want to keep slavery because it is economically prosperous. And the camp that was like, we still don't really like Black people, but we don't think slavery is right because it's against our religious morals, right? So we want to go to toe to toe around that. We're forgetting of what that fight was about even now. So then we're just doomed to repeat it over and over again. With that being said, I think that it's a mistake to talk about reparations as simple as a check. It's not just a check. And I think that that is what people get all riled up around, partially because we have this narrative in this country that people who have been othered, right, all they want is to get over on other people who are hardworking. And that is the story of America, right? There are hardworking pioneers, and then there are people who are leeches off of somebody else's hard work. And that story is actually true. It's just we put the wrong characters in the wrong places, right? So it's not repaired by a check. And frankly, there's not enough money in the world that could repair the ongoing devastation and harm that has been done to Black communities, that continues to be done to Black communities. I just watched last night the documentary on Netflix on crack. And I was like, oh my fucking God, like, excuse my language. I was like, oh my God. First of all, obviously I grew up during the crack epidemic. I'm not unfamiliar with the devastation that occurred as a result of so many different factors. But the thing that stuck out to me about that documentary, and I highly recommend that people watch it, is that they actually talked about the trauma that still exists today from the devastation of the crack economy and the smackdown that ended up happening from the United States government on Black communities who themselves were not trafficking cocaine from Nicaragua, right? It's like Black people weren't getting on private planes to
No,
go.
that was the CIA.
Cocaine. It was the damn government, right? So the thing is, when people are talking about the violence that was happening in their communities while police looked the other way, when people are talking about, you know, the devastation of losing your mother, your father, your uncle, your kids to crack addiction, right? Like that stuff lives in our families, it lives in our communities far beyond the incident itself. And so reparations has to take that into account. The harm that has been caused from chattel slavery has not ended. It is not over. We are now, instead of having people in chains, right, and not having access to full citizenship, right, Black people, we've now just done that in a different form. Now we have people in cages, okay, who cannot vote, who are working for free, right? It's all the same dynamics, but yet we're calling it something different. We called it enslavement before, now we call it criminal. It's literally the same thing. So for me, reparations is about acknowledging that a harm was done, and we have not done that yet as a nation. 2, addressing that harm, repairing it. What can we do to address what we've done? And then there's a 3rd step, which is what do we need to redo in order to ensure that we don't do this anymore? We haven't even gotten to step 1. So for anybody who's freaked out about reparations, don't worry, it's not coming tomorrow. But on the other hand, really think about why not, why it's not, and what are the consequences in a nation that cannot own up to the worst parts of itself. I'm somebody who believes very deeply that we are better than the worst thing that we've ever done. But in order to be better than the worst thing you've ever done, you have to acknowledge that you've done a bad thing.
Yeah. It's like, you know, you talked about a wound, and we have this massive wound as a country that we've never fully tended to. So all it's doing is festering, it's getting infected over and over again. And it's just never going to heal until we actually go to the wound and clean it out and look at what harm was caused and put all of the medicine and time and care and love to repair that wound. And there's still going to be a scar.
That's right.
But it's going to be able to heal.
That's right.
You know, this makes me think of a conversation we had with a previous guest, Yarlin Daniel, and she was talking about the anatomy of an apology. And I'm forgetting who she pulled this from, because she's like, look, I didn't invent it, but I like the framework. And it makes me think, this is a question I was going to ask later, but I'm going to bring it up now, because we're always talking about what can our audience do now? How can we affect change and drive change now? And it makes me think at the most basic level, as parents, we can teach our children how to properly understand harm, apologize, and move through it, right? Because can't expect people to do things outside when they're not happening at home. The home is like the micro that then, you know, goes to the meta, right? And so I'll, for our listeners, repeat that sort of anatomy again. And then I kind of want to just chat with you about that for a moment, right? And do you know about the, I don't want to be like woman-splaining to you over here if you feel like you can talk about it.
Woman-splain away.
And so it's like, I'm sorry for the thing that happened. It was wrong because you acknowledge the harm that was done. You know, if I have to do it again, I would do this differently, or like listen to like, how can I learn, or how can I understand, or how can I see what you went through? And then the last part is like, how do I make it right? And I texted Yarlin and she responded that it's from, I'm going to say this wrong, Thich Nhat Hanh.
Thich Nhat Hanh. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for saying it right. It's so important for me to try to say names right. But like on a basic level, I think that's something all of us can be doing. We learn it ourselves. We teach it to our children, right? And so what are your thoughts there?
Oh, I agree 100%. And, you know, what you said about everything we know, learning from the home is 100% correct. You know, I grew up in a household where there was a lot of like verbal violence. And interestingly, right, when I left the house and I got into relationships, I started to exhibit that same behavior, right? Even though it was behavior that I abhorred when I lived in that house, right? But it was just, it had become a habit that I then have spent literally a lifetime undoing and unraveling. And there's so much about our world that could be re-anchored if we were more careful about what it was that we were passing on, what it was that we were growing and nurturing and loving and looking away from, right? And looking into and leaning into addressing harm is important. And it's not a skill that many people have, even the best of us, right? I think oftentimes we think of harm as things that are really, really big, but they can also be really, really small. And being able to empathize, which is what I hear very much in that anatomy, and also being able to be emotionally intelligent about what you bring to the table is critical for the change that we seek. Now, with that being said, are we always perfect at it? No. And even people who I know who are like, let me talk to you about apologies. I'm like, tell me about when you last did that and how it went. Right. So I always love my friend Darnell Moore, who wrote an incredible book called No Ashes in the Fire. Before he wrote that book, he talked about I'm trying to remember the word. It's something like intralocality, where it's like assessing, right? For people who are on the margins, we're very used to talking about how somebody else's foot is on our neck, right? We're very good at identifying that. Are we as good at identifying where our feet are on somebody else's neck? Because that is also the characteristic of the way in which this country is organized. We look the other way around those dynamics, and it becomes a problem. It's good to teach our kids that stuff. Last quick story I want to say is, you know, I was thinking about how we raise kids. And for the mothers and parents in my life who are now grappling with how to talk to their kids about race, when their kids are not yet at a place where they understand that as a concept, even. They're like, this is my friend and my friend is brown, but it's not like, right? It's to help you identify them. It doesn't have any meaning for them yet. So how do you talk to young people about race in that context? And a lot of people are afraid to do that, right? They're like, they're just too young and I want to protect their like sweet innocence. And I'm like, of course. But then those are the conversations that we always forget to have. And so then what ends up happening is that they become adults who also can't have those conversations. So the reason I'm telling this story is because as a kid, and I talk about this in the book, I grew up in a community where very few people looked like me. And we all did the same things, right? I went to people's bar mitzvahs and we did sleepovers and we shared really intimate moments of our childhood and our teen years. And maybe a couple of years after I graduated from college, this is when Facebook was first like emerging. And I posted something on my Facebook about commemorating the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And I have a bunch of friends on my Facebook from high school and middle school. I stay in touch with people because I'm weird like that. And somebody who I grew up with, was really close with, like passed notes with in school, like all the thing, posted on my page and said, I cannot believe you're whining about this. You people got your president. And I was like, this is some shit. This is not some random person that I have no relationship with. I've actually known this person for 20 something years, but yet suddenly we are strangers. And we are strangers because you were not taught these things at home. Or actually, maybe you were. You were taught exactly what you posted on my page at home. Yeah. So the home is the nucleus of all the lessons that we learn about how to be in the world. And that doesn't mean that it's fixed. It can be undone, but let's not leave the burden on our kids to try to figure out how to undo conversations we're too scared to have. And frankly, at this point, coming back to your point about apologies, if we're not having those conversations with our kids, we should start to have them and also apologize for not doing it right now. Because the thing is, kids remember that, right? They remember when adults in their lives say, oh my God, I'm not perfect. I messed up. Let me explain to you why, and let me commit to you what I'm going to do in the future when faced with a different opportunity to do it differently. So that's what I want to say on that.
Yeah, so many lessons there for parents. And thank you for sharing that story, Alicia, because these are things we can do right now. They don't require money. They don't require tons of research. It's just making a choice and giving yourself permission to do it imperfectly, knowing that you'll never be perfect. And by the way, it doesn't matter how woke someone is, they're not going to get everything perfect.
Facts.
And it's okay to fumble through it. I personally struggle with this one a lot, and so I'll turn a little corner here. I'm executive at a tech firm, and as I've moved up in my career, I've learned how decisions are made and how resources are shared, right? And I've realized what it takes in the corporate space, anyways, to be effective and drive change. Mm-hmm. So I'm personally a big proponent of engagement and staying at the table and learning how to play the game, is what I'll call it, right? Some people criticize this approach. Let's think about it in the activist space, right? They criticize this approach because they see it as a compromise in values, right? And in other instances, for example, you're writing a book, you're using your voice, you're kind of making yourself center, and there's a lot of purity in the movement. And what do you say to folks who are more woke or focus on the purity in the movement, right? Because sometimes, like, the way I think about it, I struggle because it's like showing up to like a soccer game in ballet shoes and expecting to win, right? And so I'll turn it back to you. Like, what are your thoughts on all of that, right? And like trying to drive for an outcome that you're hoping to achieve.
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts. Let me start with this. There are so many people who are struggling with that same question right now. And for those of us who are lucky enough to get paid to do movement work, I think we forget, right, that there are people all over the place for whom that's not the choice that's in front of them. And they're trying to figure out how to keep a roof over their head, how not to go down the dark path of like all the things that are against your morals and values. But for so many of us, like, the work that we do is not the thing that defines us as a human being. And that's part of what's hard about our economic system, right? Is that the way that we're able to take care of ourselves isn't always also in environments that take care of us, right? And that take care of each other. That's not a judgment. It's just a fact. And the corporate world in particular is not set up like nonprofits. It's not set up like movements in that way, where it like cares about whether or not people can spend time with their kids. That's like a very new movement in the corporate world, right? It's not a long-standing pillar of what it means to be in corporate America. And in fact, often it's very opposite, because of the fact that the corporate sector has been so dominated by old white dudes, and they've set up all the rules and all the culture for how it functions. And then for those of us who are not old white dudes, we get into that sector and we're trying to figure out our place and our role in a world that wasn't shaped for us, right? And in fact, was built to keep us out, just to keep it 100. To your question about purity, you know, it's hard for me to talk about it from your perspective because I'm not in the corporate world. Like, I spend my time with people who think just like me, right?
You don't need to. I want you to
we're all
speak
focused
from
on
your
the same goal.
perspective.
But I say that in particular because I think it's helpful when we're taking on this question of purity, to make sure that we're talking about where we're positioned and where we're located. With that being said, I think too many of us write off places of change without actually trying to change them. And I'll use an example. You know, in my book, I talk about the work that I did in a community called Bayview Hunters Point for about 10 years. And coming into that work, which was really focused around fighting environmental racism, fighting gentrification, and people being moved out of their community in favor of wealthier residents. And in San Francisco, that was tech folks, right? And we had a lot of feelings about people in city government, rightfully so, right? There were decisions being made in that building every single day that were deeply harmful to the families that we worked with all the time. And we forgot that the people in that building were not just old white men in suits. They were also people who lived in the community that we were organizing, and for whom, you know, their job, right, was to do the administrative work for the redevelopment project that we were fighting. And imagine being a person like that who goes to work every day and people are talking about your community, but your community's not there. And then you go home and you see all of this devastation, things that people don't have that they need, right? You see all the ways your community should be improved. And it's like this constant tension. Well, part of the organizing lesson that I learned was that the people who were in those positions were actually the most important part of a campaign. One, right? Because they had so many different lenses to add about how decisions were being made and why, but also because they were being written off by everybody. They were being written off by the decision makers that they worked for, and they were being written off by the community. And that was a bad move in so many ways. And when we pivoted our approach to how we worked with folk, we were able to advance in a very, very different way. We learned things we didn't know. We started to understand processes in different ways. So there's that. But then there's also sometimes choices that we do have to make. I have an uncle who I love so dearly, who is experiencing a whole ass renaissance right now. My whole life, this was my uncle who was like the one Black conservative that I had ever met. Like, I have relatives from the South who have like conservative values, but like my uncle was like a Black Republican. And I was like, I don't understand this. You were born and raised in San Francisco. I just don't get it. Like, what are we doing? He's having a whole renaissance right now. And part of it is, for him, he got really tired of trying to do gymnastics around his values. And something broke for him when we all watched George Floyd die in front of our eyes. something broke for him, right? And he couldn't kind of keep going. And he would have these conversations with me all the time that were like, yeah, I know I'm in this really hectic environment, but like I'm running circles around them. And I was like, I guess, but if you're just one person, you're not really running circles around anyone. But if that's what makes you feel good, like do it. But now he's kind of like, I need to be in places where my values are aligned. And that's important to him. So I don't see that as being purist. I see that as being deeply human. And we all have ways that we have to navigate survival and also navigate industries and sectors where the work is our passion, but maybe the place isn't. We've all had that. I've had that in the nonprofit world, to be honest. And I've made a vow to myself, I will never work in a place where I cannot stand the people, right? But with all that being said, I think the lesson here is sometimes we have to understand where we're projecting our insecurities about our values onto other people. And sometimes we have to understand when we are sidestepping our values for the sake of convenience or survival. And in either case, it takes a certain kind of person to just look at it squarely and be honest about what's what. Because I will say too, this week there's been a lot of conversation in the Twitterverse about a conversation that happened on The View on Friday with Van Jones and Sunny Hostin and all these people. I'm not going to get into all the shit about it because I have a lot to say about it and we don't have that much time. But I will say, I think there's a difference between working with people who you don't agree with on everything and working with people who don't share your values around who deserves humanity and who doesn't. And it may seem like splitting hairs, but I think in the final analysis, we see how it plays out. Can you work with a Nazi? Are you compromising your values, right? Or, right, are you trying to work across the aisle? These are questions that we have to answer for ourselves and answer honestly, not just as individuals, but as movements.
And I think I love James Baldwin framed that conundrum beautifully. I wish that I could like say it accurately right now, but it was, you know, do you know the quote off of the top of your head?
I don't.
But it's
we could work together as long as, you know, what you're trying to do isn't steeped in like ruining my life or devaluing my human experience, something like that, right?
Most Americans know firmly where they stand on reproductive rights. But how did we get here? How did abortion become one of the most contentious political debates in the United States? That's where Ordinary Equality comes in. From Wonder Media Network, Ordinary Equality co-hosts Jamia Wilson and Kate Kelly are unpacking the history of abortion from the views of the founding fathers to Roe v. Wade all the way to present day. They're seeking to understand why everything related to women's rights does indeed seem to come back to abortion, and how abortion access is tied to our fundamental rights and freedoms, even more than you think. Listen and subscribe to Ordinary Equality wherever you listen to podcasts, which sort of like has me wanting to switch gears into the work that you're doing with the Black Futures Lab and how I love in the book how you talk about how our collective liberation is centered in Black liberation because of the trauma and pain that has gone unaddressed in this country. And I think for a lot of people that are just now making their way to the movement, it is because the stories that we are told are so powerfully gilded with gaslighting that
well done.
Thank you. That it is hard to break through the stories that we've been fed since we were little kids about who we are in this country and how we have never truly lived into freedom, liberty, and justice for all. And we had a conversation a couple months ago with Dr. Peniel Joseph, who's a historian and beautiful mind. And he believes that we are in the beginning of the third Reconstruction. And I love that hopeful frame that he has for it. And I see very much that the work that you're doing with the Black Futures Lab is in that. And I think that there is a place for everybody listening to move into that focus on Black liberation and how we can all participate there, because it is our collective liberation resides in it.
Absolutely. Well, I agree with Dr. Joseph, and I will say people be fighting about, is it the third, is it the fourth, is it the second, whatever. We're in a Reconstruction moment. And for folks who maybe aren't history buffs, what we mean by that is, you know, after the resolution of the Civil War, there was a period of about 12 years where the United States government had to figure out how to put the country back together again around what values, what rules would be unrigged in order to support the full dignity and humanity of people who had been enslaved, and who would benefit from those rules, right? And it was a period where people really had to step back and look at the ways in which things had functioned, take a stark look at it, and then decide how was it going to function differently, if at all. And that period is called Reconstruction. And in fact, the lesson from that period, right, there are many, but the lessons from that period are, one, that there was a massive backlash to Reconstruction, which resulted in Jim Crow laws, right? It resulted in the filibuster, right, which everybody's all upset about right now. It resulted in kind of a re-entrenchment of the rigged rules that we were trying to undo. I think we are in another Reconstruction moment. And so much of what we're facing right now is, one, how are we going to address the mandate that was delivered to this government, not from like white suburban voters, but from voters of color, immigrant voters, Black voters, women voters, etc. And then the other thing I think we're trying to figure out here is Reconstruction. So the lessons here include a massive backlash. But the lessons also include us thinking about what is possible in a short window of time that either sets the stage, right, for the next Reconstruction moment, which may not be for another 50 years, it may not be for another 100 years, right? But what are we laying the groundwork for? Or on the other hand, the question is, how do we take advantage of this window in such a way where we jam the window open forevermore? And
I like that one.
Yeah, and that is what we're looking at the Black Futures Lab through our work. We are really focused on making sure that Black people are powerful in every aspect of our lives, and that politics is no exception. Politics not just being elections, right, but the process of who gets what when. And we are really focused on articulating, right, what is the floor and what is the ceiling? And too often we start with a floor that gets articulated for us. That's the crappy part about politics, right? So everybody talks about what's politically possible. We can't take kids out of cages because there's no appetite for it politically, right? And it's like, well, what does that mean? That means you haven't done the work to make an appetite for it. But that doesn't mean that the floor should not be, right? Kids shouldn't be in cages. Families shouldn't be separated. That's the basic, but that's not the aspiration, right? That's the basic. Like, you can't go below that, but then start to articulate, well, where are we ultimately trying to go? That is the work that we're doing at the lab. And the way that we do that is really by being in conversation with our communities. And again, not just the people who agree with us. We talk to people all the time who are like, we're with you on, racial justice, but we're not with you on trans rights. And we're like, okay, let's figure this out, right? And that is the process of what it means to reconstruct this nation. It's actually to become scientific about who our people are and where we are and what we care about. And I'll give a little hint. A lot of the things we think our people care about, they don't. That's a hard pill to swallow, right? I've not met a Black person yet in our outreach and in our conversations. It's like, I'm a progressive. We're like, oh, snap. Okay. Where do we begin, right? This is the hard conversation. Not to say that we give up those folks and not to say that we give up on them. It's that we actually see our work as organizing more Black people into a progressive movement, not in handfuls, right? But in blocks. And the way to do that is by starting to better understand what it is that people care about, and then moving to create and implement new rules that help people access the things that they care about, and getting rid of rigged rules that keep people from getting the things that they need to live well. Mm-hmm. That's us in a nutshell.
Well, we love it. And we had one last question for you, which, I think you have been such a light because people can see you, right? You said, how do we find the people, right? And you and I both come from grassroots organizing and close to the same age. And, for me, it's been a struggle to take up and occupy space because for multiple reasons. But when you do stand up and you tell your own story, there can be a lot of criticism. People say that that's not our job as organizers, right? And, though I often have noticed that criticism is leveraged more towards women, especially women of color, for occupying and taking up space. But people have been able to find movements and organizations to join sometimes because they find your story. And so I'm wondering how you've faced that criticism and how you've also just turned down the noise of it to keep telling your story, because I think that impacts a lot of people feeling like, can I tell my own story? And what's the purpose of it?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked this. There's a few things of how I do this. As a very private person living a pretty public life, one of the things that I really protect is my privacy. I protect my spaces where we're not talking about politics and we're not talking about all of those things, because I need that. I need that to be able to be rejuvenated, to get back out there and take barbs and take all the things. The second thing is sometimes I mess up. That's just what it is. In the process of telling your story, sometimes people feel like you erase them from a story. And it's a hard balance to hold, right? I do think that for so long, we have been writing people out of history. It's good that people are hyper aware of it. And at the same time, I think there's also something I've been thinking about in the last few years that's about who do we want to say we were in this moment? Do we want to say that we were the people who were making sure at every point, right, that every detail was accurate? Or do we want to say, right, we won real things for real people? The fact of the matter is, I think that part of what becomes hard about being a public person, having a public profile, is that people are not going to be happy with you all the time. And you have to just really embrace that. Like, people are not going to be happy with you, for you, about you all the time. And in fact, the more visible you are, the worse it gets. Now, I don't want to act like I'm condoning that behavior, but for anybody who is getting out there and getting more visibility by telling their story or by being more vocal about what is going on, keep going, because even with the critics, right, it means that you're reaching bigger audiences. And that means there's more people to assess what they think you're talking about and whether or not they agree with it. And we should remind ourselves, right, that just because you're courageous enough to get up there and tell your story doesn't mean that everybody's coming along. So we kind of have to embrace that. However, for those, you're right, Christina, that so many of us who do get so much of that criticism are women of color, right? And the way that I try to inoculate against all the hurtful parts of that is by surrounding myself by other women of color and Black women who have platforms. Here's the thing. I always think that the things that I get are the worst things that have happened in the world. They're not. They're not. I mean, this summer, for example, we were being inundated by death threats and all the worst things. And I literally spent months like kind of tight everywhere. I was tight outside. I was tight inside my house. I wasn't sleeping. It was all this really funky stuff. And I was in a casual conversation with my congresswoman, and she was like, I've been getting death threats for 25 years. I was like, oh yeah, this is not, I was like, oh yeah, this is a part of their playbook. I was like saying to her, like, they're calling us communists. They're da. She was like, oh, they've been doing that for 25 years.
She's like, welcome.
Really, yeah, really like the only thing they have, and they just keep regurgitating it. So I just try to remember to place myself in history and remind myself that like this has been happening for a very long time, and there's people out there that can help you hold it.
Yeah.
Finally, I will say, remember that for every person that like didn't like what you were wearing when you said your thing, I remember I did a TV show one time, and I got like 4 emails afterwards that was like, you were really smart, but I hated the nose ring that you have, or like, do you have to show your tattoo on television? And I was like, this is the dumbest shit. Like, I'm here talking about George Floyd and you're focused on my tattoos. Just know that for every 4 people that will send you a message like that, there's 14 people for whom you broke open their entire universe and you made them feel like they weren't alone, and you made them feel like they weren't crazy. And that is why we do this, right? We are looking for the people who are looking for us. And if we continue to pull back the curtains and show people that there are multiple ways to enter, that's our actual job. And the rest of it is like stuff that belongs in the dustbin of history.
Yeah. You know, the thing I would tell the young women that were part of Jolt, right? Because as Latinos, sometimes we are, especially folks of Mexican descent, like we hyper idealize humility to the point of a detriment. And I'd say, look, as organizers, our job is to get people to follow us. People can't follow you if they can't see you. And so thank you for letting us all see you, and helping build and lift up a movement that is crafted and built by thousands and millions of people at this point. And I think that people, while they find inspiration in movements, they find connection to individual stories. And so thank you for also sharing your individual story and putting it pen to paper and lifting up your voice, because we know you do face a lot of criticism, but you're right. There's a much louder and bigger space of love and support, and you know, courage is contagious. So thank you for spending your evening with us on a Sunday. Yeah, that was amazing with Alicia. I find so much hope and power in her story, and inspiration for the work I'm doing as well. How did you all feel about it?
I mean, the book, everybody really should read the book. What I really love and admire about both the book and then the time that we just spent with her is that she holds the knowledge of where we've been and the vision for where we're going. And I think that she connects the two so beautifully. And that, I mean, that is just the magic of somebody that can actually lead us to the place, because I do think it's so important to know why we are where we are so that we can build the world that we want to. And so I think everybody needs to go get the book, read it. Come on.
Yeah. As I heard her chatting, just a couple things resonated for me. First, she talked about her mama not being political, but if I can look at her and the eyes in which her mama helped her look at the world, it was all political, because it's like how we define politics, right? And like how we approach things and how we find our voice to move forward, and the frame in which we look at the world. And like, I was just loving how big her frame is and how it's shifted, because there's a recognition of the systems that we're in. You know, average person may not call them systems, but like the cultural norms we're in. And we've had a lot of podcast guests who sort of code switch and go between cultural norms. And so then you can sort of see like, oh, in this space, we act like this, and in this space, we act like this, but I can't do it in both spaces. And so like, who defined what it means to make room for people at the table and why that's a good thing or a bad thing? And who defined that when I win, you must lose? And like, why is that something that we accept? And so to be able to, you know, the example that you gave, Christina, around humility, that's a big thing in my culture too. And in the dominant culture we're in, humility isn't necessarily appreciated. So then it's seen as a weakness, right? And so like, how do we shift our frame so that we can stay in who we are and stand up really strong in who we are and still be in the space we need to and be strong and powerful, right? So you don't have to compromise yourself. But you know, that part she was talking about where it's like, okay, do the work you need to, but then be real with your values. Like, that's the ideal state, right? And to make those things merge, and no one can do that other than us, right? And to stay in the game, because no matter how hard things get, we can't give up, right? And it's true at the meta, but it's absolutely true in the micro. And so like in our day-to-day with our families and our friends, being in that space and having that awareness to be honest and keep ourselves honest is so important. Because like, you know, if I go with the whole UT, like what starts here changes the world, like that is what we are as parents. Hook 'em. All right, I'm done.
Hook 'em.